Okay, so let's kick this off. Today, we're trying to make a very important decision with regards to how stellar assets are represented in Soroban. And this is a decision that we've been exploring various paths to achieve in the past few months. And we've gotten to a point where we really need to make a decision and anchor this so that we can move forward. So in order to facilitate this discussion, we put together this doc, which Justin just shared in the live chat. If you haven't read it, please open it up and take a look at it while we're talking, because it's very important. So the kind of like the crux of the decision that we need to make is between this idea of how stellar assets are represented in Soroban. The current implementation that we have has like this maximum separation where Soroban tokens are completely detached from stellar assets. So you can have a balance both in a stellar trust line and in a Soroban token balance. And we're trying to figure out whether we want to keep it that way or change to a single balance approach. And before we touch on what a single balance approach means, I do want to mention that we talk a lot about wrap tokens here. Wrap tokens is probably a really bad semantics. It's a bit vestigial to how we refer to these tokens when we started off. So we'll probably change up semantics, but I just want everyone to be on the same page that we're talking about, what is the Soroban interface into stellar assets. So I talked a bit about dual balance approach. The single balance approach is that basically accounts have just a single balance in their trust line, and that is also exposed as a Soroban balance through this built-in contract. We put together in this doc a set of requirements and non-requirements. We haven't gotten a lot of feedback on these, so I think it looks like people are on the same page. And maybe because single balance approach is a bit new, Lee, would you mind, I don't really want to poke you too hard, but can you give a very high level overview of the single balance approach as the original proposer?
Yeah. So so the goal with the single balance approach is really to make it so that any participant in the ecosystem, when they're interacting with an asset that exists on Stellar today in being held in a trust line, they only have one place to look for that account. So that account, an application doesn't need to know, a wallet developer doesn't need to know. They need to go and look at balances in two places. They only need to look at that one place. Users don't need to decide where, which balance they're going to send from or send to, all of those things. But on the same note, the single balance is really mostly focused on stellar assets. So, if somebody goes and makes a token on Soroban, their own custom token, that's like a completely separate thing. So so the idea with single balances is if you're interacting with that stellar asset within Soroban, it looks to you just like it's any other token. So its stellar assets are still exposed in Soroban with the exact same token interface. They look like any other token, like an ERC20 style token on Soroban, but we're just storing that balance in the trust line. So there's just a single location.
Right, and there's some fork in the second section of this doc around single balances, whether the trust line semantics are only preserved for accounts, or do we include trust lines for new types of entities like contracts in this approach? And we can talk a bit about that later. I think my first big question probably would be to Siddharth, if you're live on this. I know you've been the main implementer, you and John, for the dual balances, and maybe you can share with us from from a hands-on technical perspective, if we are going to move to a single balance approach, what would be the implications?
Yeah. So John and I took the perspective that we would like to minimize the relationship between Classic and Soroban. And I say minimize because we can't, like, importing and exporting actually touches requires Soroban to interact with trust lines, and there's actually some pretty complex code in there where we actually replicate like trust line semantics in Soroban. Uh, like I think we should, like, I'm still like support on that side, in that the thing you mentioned about how if we should have trust lines on for contracts, not just seller accounts, that I think is like moving in the wrong direction. And if we do single balances, we are introducing more of Classic into Soroban, and we're introducing more of the Classic protocol into Soroban. And when it's much simpler to maintain the separation as much as we can. Uh, so
So I think that specific point is something, and I think, and Nico has a strong opinion there as well. We can ask that later. I think the before we go to that, the question is, you mentioned that right now we're replicating trust line semantics in Soroban because we need to interact with trust lines through the import and export functionality. So that is true for dual balances. And obviously, it will also be true if we go for like a single balance approach. Is there significantly more kind of like classic semantics that we need to adopt in order to move to single balances?
The answer the answer is no. I don't think there would be any significant changes. For example, I think we've talked about this. You can actually use those functions, the functions that import and export use, to implement a transfer in the single balance world, right? So in that case, there would not be, it's not like the tone contract would change much. I mean, we already have to pre-flight with the trust lines, right? You're just, it's pretty much like you're just running an import, right? As a transfer. It's just like there's some slight differences. So yeah, the answer to that is no. I don't think there would be significant differences.
Okay, so I just want to make sure we're all on the same page with regards to what you're saying here. You're saying that in terms of interaction with Classic, what we have right now as import-export on dual balances, you can think of a single balance transfer as basically like as these two things combined, like an import and an export at the same time. So there's no added overhead of like interaction with the Classic probe.
No, there isn't.
Okay. So before we go into the details of more kind of like thinking about the specific implementation of single balances, is there anyone here that wants to like advocate some more for dual balances?
I mean,
Okay.
maybe the only thing I can add to the dual balance, what is good about the dual balance thing is actually on the performance side. Because if you think about the type of ledger entries that you need in the dual balance world, when you are doing Soroban payments, you only have to deal with basically one place, whereas in the single balance world, when you do things like allowances, now you're dealing with, you're dealing with two ledger entries, plus you need to read issuer information from Classic. So there's like some added overhead, but we can maybe set that for the performance or implementation discussion.
Okay, but I just want to make sure, like, when we're dealing with allowances today, even if it's pure Soroban, you still need to touch both the balance ledger entry and the allowance ledger entry, right?
Yeah, I think the only difference would be anything you would read from the issuer, right? Because you still have two balances, like on a transfer on the Soroban side, and on the Classic side, you have two trust lines.
Yeah. So you have the one-time transfer, right? Well, as far as like the balance where we store it versus the allowances, there is actually no requirement that they are separate in the current implementation. You could actually store them in the same place too.
That's true. You're saying that you would
With
have one
IO,
ledger entry with
right.
all the information. Yeah, that's not how it works at the moment, but that is true.
But I think that's a bit weird because balances operate on a key of a single account and allowances operate on two accounts. Like who owns the balance and who gets the allowance?
Right. It doesn't matter. It's basically on one when you do a payment as part of an allowance, right? You have like one of the endpoints is basically holding the allowance. So you pick which side, but it doesn't need to be a third one.
Right. But also just to zoom in on that, Sid, in terms of if we want to adhere to current authorization semantics, even if with the dual balances approach, isn't there a read to the issuer account anyway?
Yeah, if you want to do if you want to check auth required, for example, is that what you were talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, there is a read to the issuer. Although you can minimize that, right? At least in like that prototype I wrote up. If it's you only need to check if it's a new balance. After that, auth required doesn't matter, right? But that's like a minor implementation detail. Does that make sense?
Yep, that makes sense. I see that Eric is raising his hand. Maybe you can invite him to speak. Eric, you're invited.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
I just wanted to ask, are there any security implications in terms of surface area in the single balance approach? Because in the dual balance approach, it feels like classical assets are pretty separated from smart contracts and they can't be interacted with directly and so on. So in terms of things we may not have thought of, bugs that could be introduced and so on, are there any security implications by going to single assets?
By the way, this is a question that Fred from Lightman was asking in the live chat too.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I think it's in the docs somewhere, but just to give some more context on this, smart contract balances are susceptible to various approval issues. So let's say, for example, that either maliciously or because of an error, a contract asks me for to approve more funds than they actually need, and they somehow manage to get me to sign that approval. Now they can access funds that logically I don't want them to have access to. And that's definitely a problem. And that's definitely an issue that if with the clear separation of Classic and Soroban, it doesn't exist. It's and by the way, this is a problem in blockchains and in general and in DeFi. I do think that there are user actions that can alleviate some of this. I can basically have different accounts for as a user. I can have different accounts for the risky stuff, quote unquote, that I'm doing in Soroban versus the less risky stuff I'm doing in Stellar, but the protocol doesn't mandate that separation. But yeah, I think that's a super important perspective here.
And maybe I would add to this that in terms of risk, if you look at either implementation has actually a way to manipulate the trust line, right? The balance on the classic side. So either it's through this bridge, import-export type of function, or it's actual, when you do a transfer. In either case, if you have a bug, you're kind of in trouble. So I think it doesn't from that point of view, implementation-wise, I don't think it has much consequences actually.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think from an implementation perspective, it's the same surface area. But to Eric and Fred's point, the approval surface area is a bit more rope for people to hang themselves with.
But that's something that, yeah, I mean, I guess maybe something here, but that's not part of this conversation because, at the same time, I do want the Soroban tokens to be secure, right? So I think this is part of improvements we can make to the contract interface. I think there are obvious flaws in if you were taking verbatim something like ERC20.
Yeah.
I know we already started to incorporate some of the changes that were done later, but we don't need to stop there, right? It's something that I think we have to double down on actually before we launch that thing.
Right, and here's this is a great shameless plug for some of the work that we've been doing on our token contract with supporting things like permit style approvals, in which you only approve the specific amount that you'd like your DeFi protocol to use at the time. So I do want to go a bit further down the document and talk a bit about this trust line, yes trust line, no trust line discussion that we've had. I know that the original proposal that Lee made was to preserve, for a single balance, was to preserve trust lines only for accounts, but contracts and other non-account entities do not require a trust line. Which means that they can do things like, they don't have a minimal reserve, and they don't need to opt in to hold an asset. There's another fork in the road that we can take, which is to mandate trust lines across the board, even for non-account entities like contracts, like other identifiers. Lee, can you tell us a bit about why the original proposal did not have trust lines for non-account identifiers?
Yeah, I guess it just didn't seem particularly necessary. Accounts have trust lines today, and so they have a balance that's there, and everybody knows where to go to find that balance. When contracts exist tomorrow, or now in FutureNet, we already. That's an entirely new thing. There's not really any need for them to depend on trust lines. Well, we don't expect them to inherit everything, all the semantics around trust lines. So, yeah, I guess it just didn't really seem like an obvious advantage to do so. But maybe there's some implementation reason to do so.
Got it. And I will mention that there is a non-requirement section in this doc, and a later addition to the non-requirements is that opting in to hold a Stellar asset is not a hard requirement. So today, you need to explicitly create a trust line in order to hold an asset. And we are loosening this requirement for the sake of interop. Right now, we haven't gotten any... to be honest, we haven't gotten any qualitative feedback on either direction, whether this is really good or really bad. But we do know that trust lines have been an extreme pain in the ass to a lot of us throughout the years. And we are looking for ways around them, which some of these proposals including 2.1. And yeah, this is still an open question, but we're probably going to loosen that requirement. Nico, can you talk a bit from a technical perspective? What are the implications for not having trust lines on contracts, and why do you think we should have them?
So yeah, the trust lines. When I say trust lines here, by the way, I didn't mean necessarily a classic trust line. It's more of a standardized format, right? Like a ledger entry or whatever for holding balances that I'm thinking about. And this would be so that when we think about wallets, you don't have to necessarily right now, the way you can get a balance for a Soroban token is by calling the get balance endpoint. on the token. And there is basically no way to do something efficient like what you like a block explorer style. Give me the balance for any ledger entry or any account, right? A Soroban account. So like what I was thinking is that maybe there's room there for that. And in particular, I was thinking in the context of classic assets, so existing assets that are being held by, let's say, a smart contract wallet. So basically where your balance is not held behind a Stellar account, but held by a contract that enforces, policies, basically. Like in that world, it's you don't have the Horizon experience basically that you get with a classic account, like a standard account, and that felt a bit like a limiting, right, from a efficiency point of view and all that. I mean, I can see that for if you get into the generic, type of contracts, you can do a lot better than calling the actual get balance, because maybe there is actually some actual code happening there. But for those type of accounts, the classic assets, right? Like I thought we could actually do something a little bit closer to what you get with standard accounts, if that makes sense.
So I think this touches on how downstream systems handle tokens. And I think it's still an open question for Horizon, for example, how they deal with tokens. Eric, do you see Horizon actually reporting token balances for contracts?
Like you say, I think that is still an open question that we're thinking about. There's pros and cons here. Obviously, if we go down this road where assets and tokens become the same thing, then you sort of get a default answer to that question. But in theory, you can imagine a world where there's some kind of standardized token that obeys the interface of the standard contract, and we make that available. The question that I want to understand, if we're going to go down that road, is what are the use cases there? And can we solve those problems in other ways, say through streaming endpoints and then fast catch up for history? So I think we're still trying to understand the use cases. And with respect to Horizon in general, there's this question of what does Horizon solve and for who? Horizon is like a Swiss Army chainsaw. It can do everything. It turns out that when you actually analyze what people use Horizon for, the vast majority of users are using a very small number of endpoints, and also in a relatively recent time period. So we have the possibility to differentiate with different products that can actually map much more cleanly to the actual requirements, right? So that's like part of where we're thinking and trying to understand better what will be the best form factor. So I don't have an immediate answer, but it's definitely something we're actively trying to understand more.
I love Swiss Army chainsaw. I think that should be the description on the GitHub repo. So it does seem like if we're thinking about downstream systems, going back to the big discussion of single balances versus dual balances, it does seem like single balances is the least amount of friction to actually get Horizon to keep accurately report, like the classic account balances.
Yeah, so I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that on the face of it, it feels like there would be almost no work required. It would just automatically happen. The complication is to think about whether having it automatically happen is in the end a net positive, right? So to give you one example of a trade-off that we have here, when Horizon provides token balances natively, that actually encourages some centralization in the ecosystem, because in practice today, most Horizon users actually use the SDF Horizon instance. Another example is, well, if we actually identified the need for tokens, we could produce a form factor that's extremely minimal, that lots of people could run very cheaply. That might actually aid our decentralization goal. So there are some questions around that kind of stuff that I would like to put some ideas on the table around. But it is true that I think from our perspective, if balances combined, they would just pop up and appear in Horizon. And I do see a benefit from a usability standpoint. It is pretty confusing to consider them tokens and assets as separate things. Yeah.
Got it. I imagine you'd still have to account for transfers that go in and out of things that you're not tracking, like contracts. So
yeah, that's true. But that's a much more bounded problem.
Yeah, I hear you. Sid, you were talking a bit about your concerns with adding kind of like opt-in semantics to contracts and other Soroban entities. Can you tell us a bit about your concerns?
Yeah, I mean, for example, if you have a liquidity pool that's going to allow trading with like a classic asset, the contract would have to opt in, right? That adds friction. I mean, it sounds like it won't be an actual trust line, which is where some of my concerns were. But I had questions like who would own the trust line, and it adds friction that I don't think is necessary. And it's something I talked to Nico briefly about. But if you really wanted the balance of a contract, or the token balance for a token contract, you could actually look at the ledger entries, right? And maybe this is something we can encourage, but that is an option, right? Like the structure is pretty well defined, at least for the built-in token contract. So I don't like this. Sounds like something that we don't need to do, which is pretty much what Lee said, right? Like accounts already have trust lines, and that's where the balances live. But to special case the balances for contracts, it doesn't sound like unless we have a really good reason to do it, I don't see why we would.
Got it. Another thing that is an open question for single balances is whether or not we make them compatible with classic Stellar operations. Like, for example, can I just make a regular payment to a contract? This is actually in the non-requirements section, but it's still an open implementation detail. And I was wondering if people here have any opinions in the space.
I mean, to me, that seems like a pretty good thing to have, just because, you can imagine a situation where maybe there's I don't know, some contract or something that's so successful that we want to implement that functionality in Classic and make it super efficient or something. So the more sort of compatibility you have, the easier that is to do without sort of upending things, the better.
So I have concerns about that, David. I think one of the concerns is that what is the use case? Usually when you send funds to a smart contract, you actually want to do something on the smart contract side. For example, I don't just send funds to Uniswap to get a swap. I actually send funds and I facilitate a swap. So just letting the classic operations sent to a contract or a payment sent to a contract doesn't necessarily save me the need to communicate with that contract on the Soroban side. So if it doesn't necessarily save me that much, and if classic operators on the network, think exchanges, for example, have to adapt their currently supported operations, and this is something that we've had a lot of pain with dealing with exchanges adding support for muxed accounts. Most of them still don't. I think that's a strong argument to to keep the smart stuff on the smart side.
I don't think that's necessarily what David was saying though. It's I think the idea is more if you have scenarios that are very high value, you don't want to necessarily have this kind of completely like frozen, like a wall between what is classic today and Soroban. Like I think over time we want to kind of have some ways to integrate those a bit better, and this doesn't necessarily mean like you have to, for example, use the same data, like format in behind, the scene, but like you need to kind of think ahead in terms of what type of interactions I want to enable in the future. Like for me, like the deposit into a contract, like in the short, like in the near future, I would say, yeah, it's for something like an MM, no use case, right? Or like those optimizations, right? Where I can think of like maybe it's like actual deposit and do stuff, right? That we end up implementing natively. But like, I do think that in the short term, those type of depositing into a smart contract is actually useful if that smart contract is a wallet.
So I guess I've heard this brought up a couple of times, and I like this idea of a smart contract wallet, and this is kind of the like concept that concerns me, because if the whole thing that we're debating is, single balance versus dual balance, and our solution to single balance is to keep Stellar assets in Stellar trust lines, but we can also still have this smart contract wallet that bypasses trust lines. And it sounds like we could end up in a world where there are still two balances. Like we could end up in a world where even if we go with the single balance approach, we end up in a world where there are dual balances and applications still have to look in two different places.
I'm not sure I'm following. Like, I think what you're saying is because you have to, when you think of like the contract is a wallet, I think this is actually something we were discussing actually in a different context in the existing protocol. That was, we wanted to decouple your identity on the network. In today on the network is kind of your master public key, right? And so in some scenarios you have like, you actually have like different keys attached to that thing, and you actually disable your master key. And then your identity is kind of weird because it's this public key that actually doesn't mean anything. So at some point we were talking about, hey, maybe we should have accounts like your actual identity is like a hash or something more deterministic. And then the way you authorize using this account is actually a separate topic, right? And I think in Soroban you have actually a similar analogy there, where your identity, your account, is actually the contract or maybe like some other like alias on top of that. But basically you have that as an identity, and then how you use it, right? How you withdraw funds or perform transactions with that account is actually the managed by the account. So you can have like very flexible type of policies, right, around how the account works. That's like I don't know if you looked at the I mean, this is a topic for a different day, because we are actually been thinking a lot about authorization, right, like and authentication, and I don't think we're ready to kind of discuss this in this meeting, but like there are things that are highly inspired by the type of research in Ethereum that has been done with account abstractions and things like that.
Right. So I think if I try to summarize what Nico is saying, there are ways, if users choose to do that, there are ways in which they can have, under the same, signer, they can have multiple balances, whether you have like multiple accounts with the same signer, or whether you have multiple smart wallets with the same signer on the smart side. The question is, what is the default behavior? Like, do we default to two balances, like in the dual balances proposals, or do we default to a single balance? Okay. I am going to say that we have been getting a lot of overwhelming, like the responses tend to be towards the single balance approach. And so I just want to open it up for anyone else who's in the crowd right now. I think this is a lot of people. If anyone wants to talk in favor of dual balances. Okay.
Wait, are you suggesting that just anyone in the crowd can raise their hand right now?
Yeah.
To be clear.
Yeah.
If you want. Okay, hang on. Go.
Hi, Kyle here. I just have a general question around dual balances versus single balances. Is there so if we think about use cases down the line for Soroban, either at an enterprise level or a consumer level, is there any reason why the double balance would make more sense to enable other use cases? I just want to ensure, as we were discussing this, is there any limitations to use cases dependent upon this decision?
So I do want to mention that if you look at the doc at the top section, there's semantics. You can create pure Soroban tokens that either adhere to our standard interface or even adhere to whatever weird interface you want. Like, none of this actually prevents you from doing pure Soroban, whatever crazy asset you can imagine. The context of this discussion is for these standard assets that are issued on the Stellar status, Stellar assets that are already supported in various exchanges and custody solutions and wallets. Like, for these assets, what capabilities we have on the Soroban side. Now, there are the dual balances. If you look at the pro section for dual balances, there are several things there. For example, you have you can have a much bigger balance because the standard token contracts have a 128 integer type instead of the kind of like the signed 64-bit integer that we have in Stellar assets. So there are some small things there, but generally speaking, from a capability perspective, I don't think we're losing anything significant by moving to a single balance.
Thanks for the answer.
And maybe something I will add to this is that one of the things that is actually a big TBD, right? We don't know. It's I think it's in this last section, open issues, is by when you move to this single balance, right? You have to support some of the quirks that from the from the classic tokens, and in particular, you have the balance question, what is the balance of the account? Because there is a difference between what you want to show in a UI, depending on the scenario, right? Is it the usable balance or is it your actual net balance? Accounting for liabilities. So this will actually have consequences on the Soroban token interface, and because of that, right, you end up actually taking on those type of additional requirements for any token that you want to issue on the network, even if it's not a classic token, right? So those other tokens basically need to implement the if we need a concept of liabilities, for example, they need to implement that. And maybe they are no ops, but you still need to think about that stuff.
Yeah. So to your point, Nico, I think I commented on the Google Doc on this, but the idea of having a get available balance on the standardized token contract doesn't seem like a huge lift, and then native tokens on Soroban, the value returned from get balance and get available balance would effectively always be the same, as long as it's the standard token contract. But I do agree. I think personally, though, this is a pretty easy adjustment that we can make. So just having a get available balance that takes away liabilities from the return value.
I mean, this is one of the ones we know, right? Like as we go through the, designing this, I think we may find more of this type of stuff. Like if you want to write like safe code, like you need to ensure that you're not overflowing in different ways, which is something you don't necessarily need to care about as much in the uint 128, because the interface is uint or int 128, right? Whereas here the balance is hidden as a 64-bit number. So you have to deal with like special, checks. And in order to perform those checks, if you don't want the payment later to fail, and you want to kind of as part of pre-flight, or I don't know, some other check, right? Like you want to ensure that the payment would work, you need to know what the behavior, what are the safety, what are the constraints, right, on your balance, for example. Maybe. I don't know. Like I think this is the type of stuff we'll have to go through.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
For sure. And I think this is an important con that it's in the doc, but we haven't discussed today, which is you actually, there's this idiosyncrasy where the single balances are in practice, when they're in a trust line, they're constrained to a 64-bit integer, but the actual interface, the current interface that we're discussing is 128-bit integer. So you have these failures that are unexpected just by kind of like observing the types.
They're unexpected, but I think it's important that we recognize that those failures can happen anyway. So, if you have a near max 128-bit value in your contract data and you try to add a value that's going to overflow, you're going to get an error. So it's not like this is a new error case, it's an existing error case. It's just that if you have a less than 64-bit value in there and you add another 64-bit value, you might assume that would succeed when it might fail. So I think like that's the
exactly, like the contract code is written. You write checked code basically using 128-bit arithmetic, but then if you are actually interacting with those other contracts, those classic contracts, you actually get some other failure mode. So your checked code is irrelevant basically.
Lee, were you trying to say something?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I think the more like over time, once there are custom tokens or like new forms of tokens, they're going to have new failure modes too. So I'm not sure I'm not really sure how much contracts should try can make assumptions about that sort of thing anyway. But like if we're talking about stellar assets and everything is just a stellar asset, then I could definitely see people making those assumptions. So yeah, that could be bad.
Got it. And Lee, after Nico talked a bit about why he's interested in adding the opt-in semantics, even for dual balances, even for single balances, are you persuaded in any way? Lee, you're muted.
Yeah, I feel like I want to think about it a bit more, but this second model is, I think, the arguments for it are compelling. It's just the 128-bit and 128-bit issue is what gets me.
Got it. Okay. Justin, do we have any questions from the audience?
Well, first of all, I think if anyone is in the audience and wants to speak, you can raise your hand and we can bring you onto the stage. There is actually a fair amount going on in the live chat channel, although a lot of it's sort of been answered in one way or another, either via text in the live channel because people are sort of talking amongst themselves. Trying to look through to see any that haven't already come up or that haven't already been answered.
Got it. So there is one question that I want to ask the group about. This is not actually part of this specific decision, but as we're talking about the capabilities of this, this single balances token contract, should we consider, there are two built-in token contracts that we're talking about right now. One of them is a pure Soroban token contract implementation. The other is this wrap token contract or or just an interface to classic assets, which, by the way, right now is implemented as an extension of that first contract. Should we just ditch altogether the concept of a native Soroban only built-in token contract in favor of the Stellar asset one, or should we maintain both of these?
So the argument, this is something Nico's brought up before. The argument to keeping it is that the pure Soroban contract would be more performant, right? You don't have to spin up a custom WASM VM, a separate WASM VM just for the invocation into that contract. But it's not necessary, right? Because the point of we only need to make it native. We only need to make the classic one native because so you can run the import and export. So we could remove it now. It's just if anyone has concerns over the performance of the cost of running like the pure Soroban contracts, then this matters.
Right, but if you try to think about like the spectrum of contracts that might be interested in the Soroban only built-in implementation, it's contracts that are not interested in being a Stellar asset for some weird reason, even though Stellar assets have more ecosystem-wide support. So they want something that is not in the Stellar asset, which might be like I-128s instead of I-64s, and it might be because they're interested in a custom decimal value that's not 7. But at the end of the day, besides that, like, what are they getting? Like, why should they do this?
They may just not be interested in like classic Stellar support, right? And I don't know how many people would fall in that category, but that's one reason, right?
Right, and we're not saying that you can't do it, but if we are removing that contract, then basically you'll be deploying your own contract, and it's less performant. Yeah. But the question is, like, is this important enough to first class? Lee, you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I feel like I feel like we always place some value or importance on interoperability, and so I think if you're making a token that will interop with Stellar classic assets, I think the network can be opinionated and say, well, if it functions like that, it should just work. It should just be interoperable. Yeah, I really don't see the advantage in saying in even making that an option. Like we could make it flexible. We can keep it this way so it's flexible, and anybody can choose to say no, I don't want it to also be available on Stellar, but that just harms interoperability.
Yeah.
And I mean, if there are custom tokens that have completely different functionality where they're incompatible, then yeah, that makes sense. They're only going to operate on Soroban, and they're going to have a great time there. But
I do want to. I see Moots joined the team here. Moots, from a dApp developer perspective, you probably have the most experience with Soroban and the various token contracts. Any thoughts?
Yeah, and my thoughts might not be super cleared out yet, but from like a pretty high level, I guess my expectations would be that if I'm going to be attempting to interact with anything on Stellar, I would at least expect that the way that kind of works to be consistent. And I think from, not having thought about this too long yet, like option 2.2 kind of speaks the most to me, like at the current moment. And I think the main reason is that keeps the most separation, actually, which Sid, I know you disagree with, between Stellar and Soroban, mainly because if I'm ever going to touch something in Stellar, it's never actually going to leave Stellar Classic's control. such that it's going to be a trust line or some other trust line-esque data source that'll live on Stellar. And if I ever want to interact with something that's Soroban focused, that can just exist in Soroban by itself. And that kind of keeps a clear line between the sand. There was one comment I made on the doc, and I think things for users especially will get really confusing if you're in 2.1 or option 1, which is either dual balances, or I have some ability to have a balance on Soroban of a Stellar Classic asset. If we have state expiration, that can get really, really weird for users to keep track of. And trying to solve that or think through some way that you can present that and make it clear to users is quite confusing. And then just as like a little second part during the conversation after I hopped up here, I don't really see a reason why we can't have two separate token contracts. Ones that are actually going to run in Rust and be performant. One specifically to interact with assets that are on Stellar Classic, so they'll be able to manage trust lines, and one that's just a reference implementation of a basic, quite usable token, so we don't have 8,000 different reference implementations of an ERC20. It seems like both of those could be executed in Rust quite easily.
Can I just add something regarding like the native or built-in contract and non-wrapped, non-classic tokens? So basically, what we need to define anyway is the interface, and like there is really no value in not implementing the non-wrapped tokens in Rust, just because like someone would need to do this anyway, and there is literally no benefit of not doing so, because the interface still has to be followed, right? It's not like we can have two contracts with two different interfaces that one would be for classic only tokens and another one is for Soroban only tokens. No, they both have to follow the same interface, so they will effectively be the same contract no matter how where exactly has it been implemented. So ideally what we should try for is to have some standardized token interface so that contract writers could reuse it, and whether or not there will be like another implementations. I don't see any value of not implementing the vanilla version that behaves in a very well-defined way just in the protocol. I don't really see any value. Like, it doesn't give us any more freedom to not implement it.
In the current interface, does it fill this requirement, the current standard interface that we have?
Sort of, yeah. Modular import-export, which only makes sense for the classic token.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Of course. Okay, so we are pretty close to being at time. Are there any other big questions, topics that people want to discuss?
Yeah, so George was mentioning something to me around how payments and transfers work. So like payments on Stellar, and something that we haven't really discussed is, okay, so if there is this single balance, or this is even relevant, if there's a single balance and someone's doing a transfer, someone might assume that would show up as a payment operation on the Stellar side. So you might look on Horizon and you might be expecting to see a payment operation. My assumption has always been that those things wouldn't show up, like it would be much the same as how import and export works. But yeah, does anyone have any thoughts about how that would work?
I think, and this came up in what Eric was saying. Like, at the end of the day, if you have balances changing in Horizon, you need to provide an explanation for why that happens, whether it shows up as like a payment operation or it shows up as an effect. I think we can discuss, but it needs to show up somehow, or else like balances are changing with no explanation.
Right, and I think in the past we discussed that the import and export operations would show up as credit and debit effects, and so there would be visibility in that sense. I guess, yeah, I'm just curious, like, is the fact that there wouldn't be a payment operation going to be like a really big deal or not? It sounds like you're saying no, but
it shouldn't be a problem because this is no different than when you do when you have like trading, right? Like you have somebody does a path payment or whatever, and then you have like those little micro payments happening in between, right? Where your balance changes. So it's just a standard effect, not a payment, but just an effect. Yeah.
yeah, I agree. Thank you.
But yeah, to clarify though, this would be only for classic tokens. We would not do like this type of stuff for like arbitrary tokens on the network by default. Because that's the Horizon question that I think Eric had earlier, that you don't want to pull like arbitrary tokens into Horizon because then the data model becomes extremely complicated.
Okay.
I see that we're really almost out of time. I just want to say, I know that there's someone with their hand raised, and I know that there's a couple questions in live chat, and we will try to get to those after this call. But since we're almost out of time, I'll give it back to Tomer.
Thanks, Justin. So I think all the responses have been positive towards single balances. I think this is something that we need to try and prototype and or put a cap around. There are still open questions. The question around opt-in semantics is a big one, and it also depends on some feedback from more ecosystem members and partners, and just giving us some time to wrap our heads around. But I think there is overwhelming support for single balances, and we are going to try and pursue these. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.